I'm going to show you how to create your own simple lightbox in Cinema 4D and connect a few properties via Xpresso to make resizing as easy as just manipulating some user data. Now, I am by no means an Xpresso master. I am barely an Xpresso novice, but I have picked up a few things along the way from watching various tutorials, and I can set up some simple things with Xpresso. So let's get to it. What we're going to create is this very simple light box here, and all it is just two rectangles in a sweep, and the lights on either side are just two plain primitives with materials attached. And then we're going to dive into a little Xpresso stuff with connecting parameters, and finally we're going to get to some user data and how to connect that to some of your properties. So let's start with a new project. Command N. And before we start, we're going to do a couple things in the render settings. So just hit Command B to bring up your render settings. And I normally work with this lightbox when I'm working with global illumination. So let's just add effect global illumination. And I'm going to leave pretty much everything where it is. The only thing I'm going to change is in the irradiance cache. I'm going to go to smoothing and change that to 90%. It'll just help to smooth out some of the crunchiness in the render. And I'm also going to add ambient occlusion. And in this, I'm going to change the maximum samples from 64 to 128. And that used to be the default setting in some of the older versions, and it's just something I feel more comfortable working with. This isn't a tutorial about render quality, so honestly, you probably could have just skipped that. Just add the ambient occlusion. For output, this doesn't make a difference. We're not rendering anything out. So work in whatever format you generally work with. You know, I generally work in film, 1080, 2997, but it doesn't make a difference for this. And that's all we're going to do in the render settings. So to get underway here, we need two rectangle splines. So drop in 1 and a 2. And you can name things however you want to name them. You know, whatever works for you. Everybody's got their own naming convention that works for them. So you don't have to follow along with what I'm naming. But if you want to follow along in the tutorial, I'm going to name one of these box. And the other one will be sweep. And we're going to be driving some of these properties with Xpresso. But there are a couple things I want to change before we start. In the box spline here, I want to change the plane to ZY so that it runs down this Z axis. And I also don't want my lightbox to have corners like that, so I want to turn on the rounding. And in the sweep, all we need to do is change the width to 1 so that we don't have a thick lightbox. And that is pretty much that. So now we need our sweep. If you want to automatically make your selected item here in the Object Manager a child of a new sweep or extrude or cloner or really anything, just select it here in the Object Manager. Let's select the box right here. And then head over to, right now it'll be Generator. And before you select this sweep, just hold down Option and then select it. And see, it automatically drops that item into a child. And it actually also centers it to that object. And this comes in really handy when you're working with stuff out here. When you got elements spread out around a 3D space here. You know, if you need to center a cloner, extrude, sweep, anything to something that's, you know, off of this zeros here. All you got to do is hold down Option before you select it. You know, like if I have a cube out here and I want to center a sphere to it, you know, you could always do this way, which is just drop it as a child and zero out the coordinates, or you could simply just select that cube and holding down Option, select the sphere, and it puts your cube as a child. All you got to do is grab that out of there, and you got your sphere exactly where you wanted it. Just a quick tip, not exactly relevant to this tutorial, but a tip is a tip is a tip. So back here in our sweep generator, we want to drag our sweep spline so that now we got our basic box shape. Let's rename this sweep box. And now we're going to need the lights for either side. And those are just two plain primitives, so just drop a plane in there. And in the object settings down here, I'm going to change the width and height segments to 1. This isn't necessary for generating light from these things, but it's just a good habit to get into. If you don't need those polys, get rid of them. I'm also going to change the orientation to X so that it's facing in the X direction here. And I'm just going to double click and name this warm. And then I'm going to duplicate this by holding down Control and just dragging it down. And I'm going to name this one cool. And that's just my general choice for these lights. You know, if you want too warm, too cool, or whatever color you want to go with, you know, do it the way you want it and name them the way you want to name them. You know, because at the end here, you could change all of these names. If you're following along at the end and you're like, oh, well, that's kind of stupid. He's kind of an idiot. I want to name it something else. Go ahead and change it because it's not going to affect any of the Xpresso stuff. Everything automatically updates. You're not going to screw anything up. So anyway, to generate light with these planes, we're going to need some materials. So down to the material manager, and you can create a new material like this, or you could do what I do and just double click. And then double click that to bring up your material editor. Now to generate light with global illumination via material or an object, the field, or the channel rather, that we're concerned with is the luminance channel here. So you can turn off the color and reflectance or whatever is turned on. All we need is the luminance channel here. And with any kind of light that you're using in 3D programs, you don't ever want to use a pure white light. Every light has some sort of color temperature to it. Even if it's something you can't notice, there is a slight hint of color in there because light has a temperature. So you want to add some sort of color, and I'm just going to do green 245. I'm going to leave the red where it is, and the blue 235. It's a little more color than I normally need, but I generally work large, and this brightness ends up being pretty high, so it washes itself out. And we're actually going to be driving this brightness with user data and Xpresso later on, so we can leave that where it's at and not mess with anything. Let's call this warm. And back down here in our material manager, just holding down Control, drag that over to duplicate it. Name it cool. And all you got to do is literally reverse these numbers. So the top one becomes 235. You leave the center where it is. And the blue becomes 255. So you just flip them around, and then you get this cool color here. And I always forget to change this from blue to gray, so I'm going to double click down here in the material manager and make myself a generic gray, and I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to drag it onto my sweep, and then I'm going to take my cool and put it on my cool plane and warm on my warm plane. And now I'm going to organize it a little bit. I want my warm and cool into a null. So I select those and then hit Option G, and that'll drop them into a null. I'm going to call this lights. And then I'm going to take both of these and drop them into another null with Option G and call this light box. Don't worry about the way I name it. Normally this looks like this, lights. I don't know why I do that, but that's just the way I do that. Feel free to name it however you want to name it. It's not going to make a difference for this. And that's it. Those are all the elements we need to create. Everything else will be done with user data and Xpresso. So what we want to make happen here, what we want to happen, make happen, whatever, is we want to have the dimensions of this box control the dimensions of our planes. So when I change the width of this, I want the width of my plane to change, and similarly with the height. But we also want, when I take what is the sweep height, which is technically the box's width, when I change this, I want my planes to actually stay on the edge of this and move in this x-axis. So let's just do the box width and height first. To create an Xpresso tag, you just select, for this purposes, we're going to be selecting the lights null, and right click, and in Cinema 4D tags, all the way at the bottom, you have Xpresso. and that will pop up your Xpresso editor. If this is your first time in Xpresso, this can be a little daunting, like what in the world is an X group and what the... I can't really help you. I'm pretty low on the skill level with Xpresso, and I honestly don't touch anything over there. You know, one thing I can point out is this X pool right here is a pool of all of your nodes. So you have your system operators, and these are all of the nodes that you can use to make Xpresso concoctions out of. And you also have some system presets, which are presets. But I generally don't bother with anything. I just open this up and do my thing. And that's because it's simple to create nodes in here. You know, if you don't want to shift through this pool looking for stuff, you just right click in this light gray grid area and create a new node. It's got the same thing right there with just a right click. Also, right now we want to drive the width and height of our plane with the width and height of our box spline. So we would need some kind of node to do that. But what makes this so easy is you can literally just drag this object and drop it in your Xpresso editor window. And there you go. You got your box node that you can start doing stuff with. So that's why I really don't dive into too much of this stuff. I mean, custom calculate, this is definitely way beyond my skill knowledge. But dragging and dropping stuff in here and just connecting properties is fairly simple. So we also want to bring in our warm and cool planes. And to resize these things, you just move your cursor to the edge and it'll change. And then you can just drag it out to whatever size you want. You'll get used to being able to predict the sizes, depending on how many ports you're using or whatever. So what you have here, your basic node has two sides. You have this blue side, which is your input, and you have the red side, which is your output. And you just click on that blue to bring up the menu, and that red to bring up all of the properties that you can use. And if you think these look a little familiar, that's because they are exactly all of the properties that are in your object. You know, you got your width, height, rounding, radius, coordinates, basic, and you have those same things here. So that's basically all it is. You're using these parameters to control other parameters in other objects. Obviously, it can get a lot more complicated than that, but that's just the basic Xpresso start. So what we want is our box's width and height. So let's drop in this little red section in our output. Click on this. We want object properties. We want both the height. Click on red, object properties, width. So we want these two ports, which are width and height, and we want to output those values into our warm and cool planes. So on the warm side, we need to use the input. But before I mess with this, let me just point something out. Right now, the sweep right here, or actually no, the box right here, if I change the width and height, that's the width, that's the height. But if I go to my warm and cool planes and change the width, it's actually my height. So just keep in mind that those are reversed. When you change this, these are reversed. So you just got to keep that in mind when you're setting this up, otherwise you're going to get a pretty weird result. So we need our warm node right here on the input side, this blue side. Just click in the blue. We need object properties, and I'll do this backwards. Width, and then height. So this way, when I connect this straight across, they're already reversed like that. And I'm going to have to do the same thing for the cool plane. Object properties, width, and height. And now it's just a matter of connecting these things together. So to connect things, you got this little dot right here next to the word height. That's your port. You just click in the middle of that little circle and drag out a little wire here. And what you want to do is connect that wire to another port. In this instance, we're connecting the box spline's height to the warm plane's width. So you'll see it turn green like that. And once it turns green, you just let go and you got a connection. If you happen to connect it to the wrong port, to get rid of it, just click on that wire and it'll be gone. So click in the circle, drag out your wire, drop it into there, and you've got a connection. Simple, simple. So we also need the width to go to the height. And you can drag more than one wire out of each port. So let's grab another one from that height and do the same thing for the cool plane down here. And the width goes to the height. It doesn't matter if these things cross over like that. It doesn't make a difference. You're not going to get electrocuted or anything like that. So with just this basic setup, let's see what we got now. If we change the width and height of this box spline, it now automatically changes the width and height of our planes. Pretty cool. Just basic connection and parameters, and you got some pretty cool stuff happening. But we obviously want to go further than this. We want the height of our sweep to control where our planes sit on the x-axis. You know, when we make it wider, we want this to stick on the edge and just stay with it as it goes. But right now, the thing I need to point out is this whole thing is sitting on the 0, x, y, z, and the width, or rather the height of this sweep is 400. If I was to pass that value straight off to the x position of either one of these, it would be out here somewhere because this is sitting on zeros. 200 that way, 200 this way. So what you need to do is take this value and divide it in 2. And there is a way to do that with Xpresso. First things first, let's drag in the sweep spline here. And pull that out a little bit, and object properties height, because that's what we want to use. And to create a new node, you just right click in this gray grid area, go to new node, Xpresso, calculate, and we just want the math node. And that'll give us this very simple math node right here. And all it is 2 inputs and a function. So it would be input 1 added to input 2, and then it'll output a value. And if you select this node right here, and you look over here in the attribute manager, you'll notice that you have some node parameters right here. Now this will change for whatever node you have selected. If I select this cool plane here, you see how it changes over here? So if for some reason you can't find what you're looking for, just make sure you have the right node selected. So our options over here are data type, and you got a whole bunch of different things in here. And for this, we can just leave it at real. And you also have 5 different functions, basic math functions right here. And for our purposes, we need divide, so change function to divide. And then down here in the parameters, you have your inputs. Now we're going to be driving that first input with the height of our sweep here. So we want to take these ports and connect them. We want to take our height and connect it to input 1. Now you select this math node, and you'll see you have a space to input something, anything you want, in input number 2 down here. So obviously we want to divide it in half. We put the number 2. So back in the Xpresso editor, we have our sweep's height divided by 2, and that's going to output a number. Now, when you start really messing around with Xpresso and you start creating all sorts of crazy concoctions, sometimes you need to know if you are actually doing anything at all. Or maybe you just want to check your value. And there's a way to do that. Right click, make a new node, Xpresso, General, and it's called Result. And this is just a way to pass off what you're doing to see what happens. You know, in this instance, if I connect the output to my result, I'm getting 200 because it's taking that 400 and dividing it in half. If I change that, you'll see the result changes over here. So it's just a good way to check your concoctions, I guess I should call them. You know, because once you first start messing with this, you should have seen some of the things I made. And by the time you get done making it all, you have no idea if it's even going to work. So it's good to just always keep one of these laying around in here. But anyway, we want this height divided in 2 to drive the x position of our warm plane. But since we already have the warm and cool nodes in here, we actually don't have to drag that back in. You can just hold down Control and drag this. You see the little plus show up, and just duplicate them. So if it's already in here, you could just duplicate it. You don't have to drag it back in. In some instances, like this one in particular, probably would have been fast to drag it because we got ports in here that we don't need. And to get rid of those, just right-click on them and delete port. So in this case, it probably would have been faster to just drag them in, but now you know how to duplicate them. So on our input for our warm plane, you want to go to Coordinates, Position, Position X. So we want this output into our position X of our warm plane. If it, watch, it's going to work this time, guarantee it. I don't know why it does that. 2 times it won't work, and the 3rd it always does. Anyway, so let me pull this out of the way, and this is what we have right now. If I change the sweep height, it's automatically going to update that along the x-axis. Pretty cool. But now we need the cool plane to do that as well, and the problem there is that it's moving in a negative direction. So we can't just pass off that same thing. We need to do something to make that number negative. Now, basic mathematics here. If you take a number and multiply it by -1, you will get its negative version. So what we're going to need is another math node. So just holding down Control, copy this guy, and over here on the right, let's just change the function to multiply. And for our second input, let's just put -1. So now, in the Xpresso editor, you got your sweep height divided by 2, and now we're going to take that output and run it into the first input of our multiply, which will multiply it by -1. And we want that to control the coordinate position, x position of our cool plane. So just connect those 2 guys together. And you can actually close this one out right now. And let's take a look at what we got here. So now if I change this sweep, it's going to do both of those. Exactly where I want them, right on the edge. Pretty cool. And we also got the box here. We got the width and height controlling the width and height. So we have pretty much everything we need right now as far as driving positions. But what we don't have is a way to control all this stuff without having to drill down in here. You know, if you're working on a lot of things, you don't want to have to open this null and come down in here and change the height here and change the box. What you want to be able to do is control this all from one place, and you can do that with user data. So select this top null here, this light box, and down in your attribute manager, you'll see mode, edit, and user data. So click on user data, and we want to add user data. And that will bring up the user data manager. And you have a couple options over here to add data, which, as you might imagine, will add data. And you also have groups, but we're not going to get to that just yet. And with this selected, you'll have properties over here, and you'll have an example of what it will look like. So in the properties, what we want to do is to create 5 different data fields, because what we want to drive is the box height, depth, width, and I also want to control this rounding, because once this thing gets large, this can be almost like a hard corner. So I want to be able to make this larger or smaller. And finally, I want to be able to control the brightness of these planes, because again, once it gets large, I'm gonna have a hard time with just 100% light filling up that entire box with light. So I want to be able to control those 2 as well. So we're going to need 5 data fields. So for our first one, we're going to go over to name, and we're just going to call this box height. And once you have it typed out, just hit tab, and it'll automatically fill in that short name for you. And you can keep tabbing down to go through here. Animatable, might as well leave it on. You know, every now and again, everything needs to be animated. And data type, you have a ton of options here. And I'm sorry, I can't help you with any of it. I just leave it at float. And for interface, right now below this line right here, this default value, you got this field right here. This is your float field. It's just a single entry point, and you got these arrows here that you could push up or down. Now, I like to work with sliders. So for interface, Just go float slider. And then it'll add this over here, which to me is easier. You know, it's up to you. It's all preference here. If you like just that single box, just leave it at that single box. But I prefer to have the slider. And for unit, we want to work with a real value, so we change percent to real. And I like to work large, so my max size is going to be 10,000, which is pretty big, but like I said, I work pretty big. And because I'm working that large, I don't necessarily want my steps to go 1, 2, 3, 4. I might want to jump higher steps. So I can change this to 100, and now when I move my slider, it jumps in the hundreds. So I know some people work small because I have imported your models and they are teeny tiny. Because some people, I guess, like to work measurement-wise very realistically. So if you're working really small, you know, you can always make this like, I don't know, 0.2 or whatever you're working at, and you can make this max a lot smaller. So it depends on how you work. For these purposes, though, I'm going to leave this step at 100. And you also want to create some kind of default value, because once you connect this with Xpresso, it's going to immediately pass off that value. So you want to have something in there. You don't want to have 0 in there. So I'm going to go with 500 for my default. And as far as this limit min, limit max, slider min, slider max, just leave everything the way it is. You know, I haven't run into too many times when I've had to change this. And that's probably because I don't know all that much about Xpresso or user data for that instance. But it seems to me whenever I take limit max off, my numbers go all crazy. So just leave everything the way it is. You're never really going to run into a problem. Just make sure your max number is basically higher than you think you will ever need it. And that's all you need to do. So now we essentially need 2 or 3 of the exact same thing, just with a different name. So instead of creating add data and going through that whole thing, you can just select this box height, hold down Control, and make a copy. And then go over to the properties and rename it. So box depth, hit tab, and there you go. Everything else is exactly how you need it. So let's do that with box depth, copy it. And this one will be box width. Hit tab. And we can actually do this again. So let's just copy this again. And this time we're going to name it rounding. And just hit tab. Now, something I want to point out is when you're connecting this with Xpresso, there are actually 2 properties in this box spline that have to do with that rounding edge. One of them's called rounding, but it doesn't do what you think it would do. So just keep in mind that when you're connecting them, the actual thing you're connecting it to is called radius. So if you want to name this radius to make it clearer for yourself, go ahead and name this radius. I just remember, because I've made the mistake a billion times, I just remember what I need to connect to, and I refer to that as rounding. So it's up to you, radius, rounding. Unit, I can use the same. I also want a slider. Step, though, I don't need it to be that big. So I'm going to take that back down to 1. And my max is going to be 2000, and my default 100. And now I need the brightness here, so I need to add another data, add data, and over in name, call this brightness. Hit tab to fill that in. I'm also going to change this to a slider, but this one can stay at percent because brightness is measured in percent. Only thing I'm going to change is the max to 300 and the default to 100. So there you go. Before we dive into groups, let's just click OK here so you can see what this looks like. And you see down here, you got user data and all your cool little fields in here. As you may notice, when you move it, it does absolutely nothing. And that's because you actually have to connect it to those parameters with Xpresso. But what I wanted to point out before we mess with that is right now there's only 5, so it's not really all that bad. But it's already starting to get like a little bit scanning through, like, all right, where's the one I'm looking for? And if you're starting to work with character rigging and animation, you can have tons in here. And you don't want to really have to fish through those to find the one you're looking for. So that's when the groups come in handy. So go back into the user data, click on user data, manage user data, and go to add group. And name it something that makes sense. I'll go with box area. And you have some options down here, and I almost always leave it at default. You know, sometimes I want a couple columns. That's about the only one I ever change. But for these reasons, we're just going to leave it at default. And you want to select your box height, depth, and width by holding down Shift, and then just drag them into that group. You know, you can create your group first and add them in there. That's the better way to do it, but just for tutorial purposes, I showed you the other way around. And now, if you had a ton of them in here, you could just twirl them down and deal with them as you need. So click OK, and you can see down here in your user data, you now have a group and that you can twirl open and closed whenever you need it. Just keeps things a lot more organized, and especially once you start to put a lot of things in here, you're going to need those groups. But let's get to actually tying these values to parameters so that they actually do something. Now, if I click on my lights null and double click on the Xpresso tag to bring back up my Xpresso editor, you can see I have space in here to do more things. Now you can actually, you know, just like in your viewer, if you have a numeric pad on your keyboard, holding down the number 1, you can pan around and you can see you have tons and tons of room to do stuff. You can also zoom out holding down the number 2. So you have room to do a lot of stuff. And this is why some people only use one Xpresso tag. Other people use them on almost everything, but for me, I like to keep them organized into what they're for. So these connect all the parameters together, but to generate my user data, I want to do that in another Xpresso tag. So close this out, and on the top parent null there, the light box, just right-click and Xpresso tag. So that gives us a new clean tag. And, you know, this is just my preference. If you want to do it all in one place, or you want to put them all on all sorts of different things, that's entirely up to you. But this is just the way I do it. So we created all that user data in this lightbox null. So just drag that lightbox null in here and resize them. And make it kind of big because we're going to have 5 ports in there. And we want that user data to control our box. Drag him in. Our sweep. Drag him in. And just like you can drag objects here from your object manager, you can also drag materials in here. So drag in your cool material and your warm material. So we need the user data for our lightbox, or our lightbox null here. And that'll be in our output right here in the red. And you got user data. So start filling this in. I usually go box height, depth, and you see these things gray out as you select them. This comes in really handy too when you're working with a lot of them and you forget which one you put in there. Not that that's ever happened to me. And rounding and brightness. And if you have a lot of things going on in here, and once you have everything connected, if you want to kind of like, if you are going to work in one Xpresso tag, you can always double click this name up here at the top, and it'll collapse it into a tiny little thing like that. And you can double click it again to open it back up. So if you do want to work all in one, it's a good idea to collapse them when you're done connecting stuff. So we got our box node, and our sweep node's only going to have 1 value. Our cool material, the name of it is actually luminance brightness, so it needs to be a little long there. Same with the warm material. And in our box, we want to control on the input here. We want object properties height, object properties width, and here's where you'll see where that problem can come. See, it's got a rounding one here, which is only the checkbox. And you'll sit there wondering why it's just turning on and off. But we want to connect it to the radius. So just remember that. And for the sweep, we want it to control the height. And for our 2 materials, if you click on the input, you'll see all these options that you find in materials. There's so much you can do. Just with this basic understanding of Xpresso, look at all the things that you can connect between objects and materials. I mean, with a little creativity, there's really no end to what kind of cool stuff you can do with this. But for our purposes, we're going to luminance, luminance brightness, and same with the warm. And once you have all your ports in there, all you got to do is connect them up. So box height will go to box height. Our box depth is actually the width of the box spline. And our radius is our rounding, unless you named it radius and you were smart. And our box width is actually generated by our sweep's height. So box width to sweep height. And then the brightness goes to these two materials. Oops. And drag another one out to the other port. And that is that. You have everything connected. You can close out the Xpresso editor. And you can even twirl this null close because you don't need to get into it. All you need to do is actually select it, and you got all your user data down here tied to everything. So if you want to change your box height and depth and width, see, this gets to be a little bit of a hard angle there, and just change the rounding. Just like that, quick, fast, simple. And we even have the brightness set up to our materials, and we can change that as we need more or less light. But let me show you the inside of the box to show you why I always have that brightness control in there. Actually, I'm going to need to bring something in here. You do U. Command C, head back over. Command V to just put them in there. And I'm going to jump out into the right view here. And as you can see, that thing's pretty big. And that's why I generally work really large. You know, this thing was created in Illustrator. And those Illustrator document settings bring it into Cinema 4D, and they translate fairly large. I know I can change the interpretation so that it comes in differently, but I'm used to working large at this point, and I don't work with architecture stuff, so I don't need any kind of accuracy there or product stuff. So I just work large. But again, it doesn't matter because I have my lightbox set up. If I need it smaller or larger, I can just easily do it right here. One thing when working with a lightbox is you don't want to drag your object down to where you want it in the lightbox. What you want to do is drag the lightbox and position your object in that space. This way, if you create something new, it's right here at the zeros, and you don't have to worry about continually dragging stuff around when you want to set things up. It's just an easier way to work. So let's go back to the perspective, and I'm sure you've tried to drag your view camera through these. You get stuck in the wall and you can't get out. So let's just go to the little stoplights here and turn off the view. 1 and 2. Now, if you want to jump those 2 steps, if you don't want to have to click 1 and 2 every time you do that, just hold down Shift and click over there, and it'll jump those 2 steps to turn it off. And if you hold down Shift, it will jump 2 more steps. So just keep that in mind. That's what you're doing when you're holding down Shift. You're actually jumping 2 steps in that process. And while I'm at it, I'll show you a couple other keyboard shortcuts for the stoplights. Holding down Control will turn everything off in that hierarchy, or at least for the view. You know, it'll do the viewpoint. And similarly, if you did the renderer as well, it'll just do that single one. And Option will actually turn off both the view and renderer, and Option and Control will turn off everything in one shot there. And if you want to add those 2 steps, adding Shift to any one of those, you know, like Control did this, but if I add Shift to it, it will jump those 2 steps. And that works for all of them. Same with Option. Hold down Shift, it'll jump those 2. And even the big daddy, Option Control, if you add Shift to that, you jump your 2 steps. So, just a little keyboard shortcut stuff there. And, whoops, I did something wrong. There's a reason I was doing this one. Oh yeah, shutting off my lightbox. That's where we were. So I could zoom in without getting stuck in the wall. I'm in the process of figuring out how to animate this guy properly with some pose morph tags. Anyway, turn the lightbox back on, and we are now inside the lightbox. And I'll just do a quick view render, Command R. And this is what it looks like right now with that brightness at 100. You see my box is really big, so I'm not getting enough light in here. So this is why I always tie this to this light box. So now I can just take my brightness instead of having to double click and go in both of those. I can just drag this up and my light box is much brighter. Pretty cool. And the reason I generally, well, let me render that back up so that you could see the effect that the warm and the cool lights have here. You know, especially when you turn the brightness up. Obviously you can still see it there, but when you turn the brightness up, it loses some of that deeper yellow or blue. And again, it's totally up to you. You could put whatever lights you have. The reason I started working with this is because I like the way it looks with reflective materials. So let me just dump in a sphere real quick and create a quick reflective material in some manner of blackish. GGX from L. And just drop him in, just so you can see what it looks like with a reflective surface inside this light box. It's pretty cool looking. And now it's fully customizable. So if I delete everything out of here and just leave my light box, I can just save this file. And whenever I need this light box, just go to File, Merge, and drop my light box in. And everything will come in. My materials, all of my Xpresso connected, everything will be just ready to go. You only have to do this once and you could just reuse it all the time whenever you need it. So, pretty simple, right? There you have it. A fully customizable light box that you can control in one spot via user data. This will save you a lot of time and work that you'd otherwise have to do manually, because if you think about it, you got about 12 different things that you would have to change manually. You know, I'd have to go in here to the width and height and same, and then I'd have to move these in X and resize them. But with Xpresso and some user data, you got 5 fields that does everything for you with just a quick move of the slider. And it's really basic Xpresso, nothing complex, but you could see with that basic Xpresso how much time you can save yourself. And obviously the options are endless for what you can create with that. And you know, and if you have some sort of skills in mathematics and stuff, you'll probably be able to get much better at this, much faster than I probably ever will be. So my name is footthumb, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you have any questions or comments, just head down below and let me know. Also, if there's anything you'd like to see a tutorial for, let me know. As I said, I'm barely an Xpresso novice, so I can't get too complex with the Xpresso, but there's a lot more to Cinema 4D than just Xpresso, and I have a fairly firm grasp on most of the concepts. I also have the plugin Xparticles, so if you're interested in learning a little particle generation, or you just want to see how that plugin works, let me know and I'll put something up. Again, my name's footthumb, and thanks for watching.